All right, so it's great fun to present to you on this topic. Obviously designed to be somewhat controversial and get you thinking. So I'm going to give a little bit of a review from some of the things we've been sharing in some of the previous ARF conferences over the years. But we're going to do this today in a series of steps. So today we're going to talk about 5 things. One is, what is attention? How do we understand what that phenomena is? Then we're going to go up another level and we're going to say, well, whatever it is, how do you measure it? Then we're going to say, okay, now we know how to measure it. How do we make that measurement work with scale? That's the next challenge we have. Then oriented where, are we talking about the, just as Bill was talking about now, are we talking about people looking for the exit button? And then finally, we're going to talk about, can AI step in and help replicate a lot of these things that we're doing in other ways? So a lot of ground to cover. So first, measuring what? We've talked about this again in previous years. What is attention? Attention is this capacity, whether in an automatic or controlled sense, to be able to focus your limited cognitive resources on stimuli. But what we've discovered in the research that we've done together with the ARF Institute is that as an industry, we have looked at attention incorrectly. Because when you think of attention, you think of it as a scale where more is better, but that is actually not borne out by the evidence. And that's consistently been the case for decades of research. So what we know is that inattention is the issue. If you have inattention, you can't process the ad. If you have more attention, it doesn't mean anything. It's other variables that matter from that point going forward. So attention is just a foot in the door. That's it. That's all we're interested in, is do we have the attention? And so we really want to think about attention as this threshold above which we then have other variables that can deliver their value. So inattention is the problem. And why do we argue that we should be focusing on inattention rather than attention? And here there are a couple of things. One, as I was mentioning earlier, attention is not linear. That's a big deal. But here's the more important thing. In the study that we presented in 2019 with the Ehrenberg Bass Institute, what we shared with you was that the different published resources, the published tools that are validated tools for measuring attention, they all converge and agree on what inattention is. So if you're trying to measure inattention, you can use blink duration, you can use EEG, you can use heart rate. They're all going to correlate highly around this is inattention. But they don't correlate with what is attention. And what does that tell you? That tells you that there is not one kind of attention. There are many different kinds of attention. And so these measures, these different measures, are picking up the different kinds of attention. So as an industry, if we want to talk about attention, we don't have a stable construct. That's why we have to focus on inattention, because inattention is a reliable and stable construct. So again, this is trip down memory lane. That's the reason why, because inattention is a more reliable construct. All right. So now we know what we think attention is. It's the absence of inattention. And we know what inattention is because we can now talk about it in reliable terms. So how do you measure it? So again, the project that we did in 2019 for Google, this was MediaScience and Ehrenberg Bass. And what we discovered in that was we took every method with the exception of fMRI, and we looked to see which of the methods that have been validated in the scientific literature were best in class for measuring for inattention. And the 4 measures that stood out were heart rate, visual fixations, and I want to clarify, visual fixations is not eyes on screen. Visual fixations is the movement of your eye to different points, because that's when you're really engaging with the content. Blink duration, when you are not engaged, the duration of your blinks are longer. And EEG alpha wave. And EEG alpha wave is the gold standard. That's the highest, that's the most credible measure we have of attention in the market today. So now why is eyes on screen? Why was that not one of the measures there? Because we didn't talk about eyes on screen as one of the 4 best-in-class measures. Yet that is precisely what we have prioritized as an industry in terms of how to measure for attention. Why is that the case? Now, I want to clarify something here. It is not in my best interest to tell you that eyes on screen is not a good measure, because more than anybody in this industry, we have over 200 eye tracking stations, right? We are big players in measuring eye movement. So it's not in my best interest to say up here, this is not the best way to measure attention. But I'm telling you that because it's the voice of truth. And there are reasons. The first reason is that people are often paying very active attention when they're not looking on the screen. You watch the news at night. You're looking away from the screen all the time, but you're actively paying attention to what's going on. Celebrities are there on these talk shows. They're talking. You're very actively processing everything they're saying. You're not looking at the screen, right? So eyes on screen is misleading because people are paying attention even when they're not looking on the screen. But also, when you're looking at the screen, you're often not paying attention. You're looking through the screen. And this is the reason why fixations are better than eyes on screen, because at least with fixations, you're seeing movement to different points on the screen. So you're more actively engaging with that content. Now, phase 2, which we presented at the ARF, again, this was the same project for Google with Ehrenberg Bass and MediaScience. This was now phase 2. In phase 1, we used pure stimuli, which is video clips, for example, of a pond with a duck on it, right? So very pure stimuli to get at the phenomena of inattention and attention. Phase 2, we actually used ads. Ads are much more complex. A lot of things are happening in ads, so much more complex stimuli. Here, only 2 measures stood out as best in class: heart rate and EEG. So that's where we are to date. Now we're going to go forward. Now, as an industry, as I was saying, we've been fixated on eye tracking, but this has represented a little bit of a blind spot for us as an industry. That was a pun. And the first reason is because many of the ways that we're measuring eye tracking are not, in my opinion, actually accurate. And in particular, they lose their accuracy over time. And that's a big problem for us. And oftentimes we're actually using these measures on platforms that are not even the platforms that we're measuring for. So for example, we're looking at eye tracking that's collected on a phone, and we're drawing inference about what people are doing on a connected TV. That's a little bit nuts, right? That's not where we should be as an industry. And even if these measures are accurate, and again, that's questionable, the next issue is, what eye tracking metric are we using? If we're using eyes on screen, that's not the right metric. And then we come to the next issue, which is, even if we have the measure for visual fixations, that's still not best in class. We learned that heart rate and EEG were best in class. So we're kind of like looking up the wrong alley here. So the best in class measures are heart rate and EEG. So now we come to our next problem. Well, how do we get that to scale? So obviously EEG is not going to scale. You're not going to get these EEG systems out there in the masses, so that's not really viable. But heart rate can potentially scale. And in particular with heart rate, we have the opportunity potentially to have fitness tracking data. So you could, in theory, have a panel out there in the universe where you had ACR and fitness trackers, and that was collecting data in real time and giving you this attention metric that it would be generating. And that's what we're going to explore a little bit more today. So to test this approach, we did a pilot project. Now, this project is massive in scale, probably one of the largest biometric studies ever done, and it's just a pilot project. So I want to be clear that there's a long way to go here. But what we did is we tested a sample of over 4,000 test sessions. In biometric terms, you often see vendors talking about a study with 30 sessions. So 4,000 sessions, this is a very, very, very large sample. We used our StreamPulse platform. For those of you who don't know, MediaScience has we operate our own connected TV channel. So we have our own version of like Netflix that you can download. What's great about it is we have every skin there, so we can make the experience look like Netflix, we can make it look like Hulu, we can make it look like Max. And we have these experiments where people go into that platform. This is better than ACR because we actually know what people are watching, right? We have this very, very, very reliable method of knowing that people saw what they were supposed to see. And we have the log files on that. So we had people in home who used fitness trackers that we sent them, that we had access to their data for. So we have 2,437 sessions where people are using these fitness trackers in homes. And we had people in our labs where we had very reliable, which is our reference data. So this is what we're using as the gold standard against which we're going to weigh up the people in home. Now, this is the experiment that we're doing. We want to know, can fitness tracker data give us this data? And ideally, we'd say yes. It's good news and bad news. So the good news is that we got correlations as high as 0.81. So for some of the programs that we tested, this was brilliant and it worked really well. But overall, it was only 0.32, which is crap, right? That's not great. And the issue is there is so much noise. Like the real world is so noisy. And the biggest source of noise, people being on their mobile phones. So you go on your phone, you're watching TV, you go on your phone, forget about it now. Your data is not telling you anything about what people are doing on their TVs now. Now it's telling you about their experiences on their phones, which don't reflect what you're picking up in your ACR code or anything else. So this is a big problem as an industry. And also I want to put a word of caution. HR data, heart rate data, is not easy data to work with. It's a very complex measure which requires calibration to each individual. So don't think that this is just something you can kind of like look at the raw data and kind of draw these conclusions on. It's a complex measure. So there's a lot of work to do, but remember, we hit 0.81. So what that tells us is that there is actually promise in the measure. So this is an arena that we should be doing a lot more research in because it holds that potential and that promise for us as an industry. So next steps now with this, what we're doing next, the first thing we're doing is we're mining our data. Obviously, we have a very, very rich data set, and we are trying now to understand, are there things that we can do that will help us improve the signal to noise ratio? Can we figure out what kinds of signals we have there that are telling us where noise is present so that we can filter that, clean it up, and actually get better data? And at the same time, we've started the process of our next very large study. What's better about this is our first study used our own fitness trackers, which we sent to people. In the next one, we're negotiating our final deals now for access to real fitness tracking data. So now instead of it being us recruiting a panel, it's actually recruiting a panel in the wild and using their own data combined with ACR. That's what we would need to get to panel level data of this type. So that's where we're going next with that. All right, oriented where? Now, the key here is that, okay, are they paying attention? That's just the first hoop. Now, the second hoop we have to get through is, where is their attention being oriented? Is it oriented towards the brand or is it oriented to something else? If we're showing that there's attention, but if that attention isn't oriented to the brand, what's the value of that? And then, of course, once we get through that hoop, then we have a whole bunch of other hoops that we have to jump through around whatever the effects are that we think that our messaging is then going to have. So if you've seen this video, don't tell anybody else. But if you haven't seen it, you're in for a really good ride. So I want you in this video. This was a study that was done by Chris Chabris, who was with us in the first Neurostandards project, and Dan Simmons. And what you're going to do here is your task, and listen carefully, is you have to count the number of times that the white shirt players pass the basketball to each other. So you can bounce it, you can throw it, it can bounce on somebody's head, that's fine. But a person throws, a person receives. How many times does the person receive? And try to count this accurately because it's really important to get the right number. So everybody now watch this video and start counting. 1. Just count it in your heads. 2, there we go. Okay, what was the magic number? How many times did you count the basketball pass? 15? Who had 15? Raise your hand if you had 15. Okay, how many of you, all of you, saw the gorilla? Oh, have you seen this before? How many of you who haven't seen this before saw the gorilla? Okay, a few of you. So I'm going to show you again what you just saw. And again, if you've seen this before, you'll remember. This is the same video. You can read about this in the book, The Invisible Gorilla. And this is the problem. And the problem, of course, is distraction. And distraction, I think, is actually a bigger problem than attention. And we have a lot of work as an industry to do to understanding distraction. Of course, I don't have time today to talk about that. So now finally, we get to this question of, is it AI replicable? And there are a whole host of issues here with this question. So the first thing for us to start about, we all love ChatGPT. How amazing, right? How incredible. Not all problems lend themselves equally to AI. Nate Silver does a great job in his book, The Signal and the Noise, about talking about some types of things, like, for example, if you're predicting for baseball, the nature of that sport lends itself better to analytics than other sports. And so you have to really understand, okay, well, is this the kind of problem? This is what Karl Popper called, is it clock science or cloud science? So I'll give you a great example of clock science in this space, the work that NBC is doing on their AI team around looking at the mechanical features in programming. So this is things like using AI to count the change in shots. And then from that, you can actually deduce what the pacing of a show is. And so they can take all content, whether it's NBC content or not, they can analyze what the effect is, for example, of the pacing of a show in terms of rate. Brilliant, great application. But when we're dealing with human behavior is incredibly complex, contradictory. There's all kinds of things that are going on there. If you want to analyze that Mars ad, the Snickers ad, that has, the player saying you're not yourself when you're hungry and has Betty White there, it's really complicated to look at how is that working? Why does that work, right? And so that's the first problem. This is a cloud science problem. Trained against want reference data, right? We are claiming that this is a system that is going to measure attention. Is it measuring attention or is it measuring something else? It depends on what the reference data was. Are we using EEG data, which is gold standard, or are we using something else? A lot of these companies that are providing these measures are using sales lift as a measure. Sales lift has nothing to do with attention. It's true that you need attention to get sales lift, but you don't measure for that by measuring sales lift. You can have an ad score off the charts in terms of being phenomenal attention and zero in terms of sales. And so you're not measuring the correct phenomena. And finally, with what validation? We need independent third-party validation of these measures to make sure that they're really measuring what we think they're measuring. Now, we are moving way too fast as an industry, adopting, incorporating, talking about currencies against measures which have not been validated. And again, I applaud the ARF for the attention validation project that's currently in motion. All right, conclusions. As an industry, we should be focusing on inattention. Eye tracking is not the best measure. Heart rate and EEG are better, but only heart rate scales. There's a lot of work for us to do to making HR work, but the point is, it is a viable measure. And so we have to invest the time and effort to figuring out how to really harness its potential. And finally, be skeptical of AI. Hopeful, optimistic, we want it to work, but let's be skeptical and let's make sure that we have proper validation against the measures which are coming into our market. And on that note.
Well, thank you, Duane. We promised controversial, and I think we got it, plus a gorilla. All right, next to it, I can't see, yeah.
Hi, everyone. Karen Nelson, Field Amplified. I couldn't agree more with, I've got a list. More time is not better. Totally agree more. That was something that the industry talked about 4 or 5 years ago before it was kind of, researched in a better way. Couldn't agree more that tracking attention switching is mega important because the next thing is human behavior is complex. So I couldn't agree more with that. I also agree with sample is important. I mean, we have tens and tens of thousands which extrapolate up to millions of data points. So I couldn't agree more with that. What I struggle with, and my question is, you talk about inattention, because I totally agree inattention is an important metric. Totally agree, because it's essentially the opposite of attention, right? But you say that that is, I guess, a reliable and universal measure against an industry that's not, I guess, consistent with their operationalization of attention. But how can inattention using different technology not also be different? So why are you saying that EEG or heart rate is universal when it's really just a technology no different to any of the others in the market?
Well, I think that was really the point of the two Ehrenberg-Bass, the studies that we did in collaboration with Ehrenberg-Bass, right, was that there are a number of measures that have been validated in the literature. That's what we started from. So let's start with all the measures that have been properly validated. Forget all the rest of it. There's a lot of other stuff out there. Don't worry about that. Let's focus on the ones that have been validated.
What's validated to you?
It's not about me. It's about the literature.
Published.
It's about published literature. It's withstood the test of peer review, right? So now we say, okay, these studies that have looked at attention have not been in the media context. So now let's take all these measures, like pupil dilation, right? Pupil dilation is a great example. Great measure, doesn't work well for the media context. Why? Because the intensity of light in the TV screen is constantly changing. That changing of the intensity of the light in the screen, it's going to give you a very distorted picture. You don't want attention to be only brighter images or something, right? So we looked at those measures. We then applied it to the media context, and now which measures are best in class. And so those were the 4 that came out with what we'd call pure stimuli. Then we took it a step further with AxS stimuli, and that's where you ended up with heart rate and EEG. So it's just a question really of, and again, that's not the only way to go about it. We welcome all scientific inquiry around what's the best way for us to do this. It's just there's not enough of that kind of discourse in our industry. Instead, what's happening is we have vendors who are coming up with their own definitions, their own, not based on the literature, not based on the science, bringing it to market and saying, here's what attention is. And we have an industry which is drinking the Kool-Aid, and that's a big problem, because we shouldn't be in the business of what vendors are providing. We should be in the business of science.
So thank you for this conversation, which will be continued this afternoon and